I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, Naturopathic Doctor. Welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. I'm Dr. Jordan Robertson. I'm a naturopathic doctor in Ontario, in Canada. And I'm joined today by one of my friends and colleagues, Dr. Keara Taylor. Welcome to the show, Keara.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Me too. We're diving in on PMS, and we've talked about this topic a lot of times on the podcast in a few different angles, but we're going to focus on a couple things today and mostly give you some tools that you can take home from today's episode to start to work on things yourself. And I think that's one of the challenges of working with women with hormonal health is that we quite often feel a bit powerless to the situation. It feels like our hormones are something that are happening to us and that we don't have a lot of say in how it feels because, by the time we're in the thick of those changes, we're thinking mostly about mood changes today. It feels like it's a bit too late, right? It feels like you just have to kind of hang until the darkness lifts. I want to give you some practical strategies and give you some ideas on how to manage your PMS over the course of the month. Keara, I always ask every guest this when we get started, but why PMS? Walk us through how you got to this place in your career where you're known for working with people in PMS. This is your research focus. Yeah, walk us through how you got here in your career.
Yeah, I think even with coming to naturopathic medicine, I think like so many of us, it's a combination of intense interest and passion for health, and then also our own personal experience. So that's kind of what led me to naturopathic medicine. Prior to this, I actually worked as an accountant for many years in my 20s, and kind of through that experience of working in a very corporate field, a lot of stress, something that I also wasn't very aligned with. It took its toll over time on my own health. So even just starting to notice some anxiety and issues sleeping, and then PMS for myself, because I was just living in this very, very, very stressed out way and not taking care of myself. And then seeking a naturopath myself, which is how I kind of discovered it. And I was like, wow, this just felt right. This is what I wanted to be doing. And then that just kind of went into my clinical practice. So really, I have an intense passion and interest in hormones and how they really affect so many areas of our life and our physical body, our emotional health and whatnot. And just seeing women in practice, really struggling with their mood and just kind of how they were feeling through the month. So that kind of is what led me to be so interested in supporting women in this area, researching in this area. And that's kind of how I found myself here now.
So I'd love if we could just talk a little bit about what is happening with PMS. I think there's a lot of confusion about that. And I think you and I both have the same frustration for some of the ways that we talk about our hormones in the health and wellness space. That I think actually makes women feel more powerless, right, to their experience. We talk about detoxifying from hormones, or that, your hormones are causing all your problems. I'd love if we could talk a little bit about what we know right now about PMS. And I know we don't know all the answers, but why does it happen? What is happening? Can you contextualize that for us a bit?
Yeah, it's so interesting because there are so many myths out there. And what we know about PMS is that it is not a hormonal imbalance in the sense of like you have too much of a hormone like estrogen and not enough of a hormone like progesterone. So there are no, blood tests or urine tests or anything like that that we can diagnose PMS with. PMS is actually our brain and body's response to a normal hormonal physiological process. So meaning that it's when we experience symptoms in the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. So the week or two before the period, after ovulation, it's a range of like physical symptoms. So breast tenderness, bloating, water retention, emotional symptoms, mood swings or, feeling down, irritable, fatigued. And then those symptoms get better with the period or within a few days. So some women will describe like their period comes and it's like a relief immediately. That doesn't have to be the case as long as within a few days they're feeling a little bit better in that follicular phase. So we know that women with PMS don't have different hormone levels. It's more about how their brain is responding to the like fluctuating hormones. So those like estrogen and progesterone that peak in the luteal phase and then kind of withdraw. And there's different theories out there about whether it is due to like a progesterone metabolite like allopregnanolone and how that kind of acts on GABA receptors, inflammation, serotonin, like there's a bunch of other kind of theories, but we know that basically it's just our brain's response to a hormonal process.
Which, that can feel like, it can feel like we're saying it's not a real thing, right? Or it can feel like it's not a real thing. And I think even in medicine, we hate when we can't measure something and we're relying on sort of the subjective experience of the person to validate what they're experiencing. And so I think that's probably why it can feel so frustrating for women, is because they want to be tested. They feel like something's really wrong. And when we say, oh no, it's the way your brain's responding.
Yeah.
Like that doesn't feel that tangible. Do we know? Well, I know we know, but I'd love to hear your opinion on the things that we know that will worsen that experience, right? Because, if we ask women that when they're like 17, how they feel after ovulation, they'll go like, what ovulation, right?
Exactly.
Like they don't know that they're ovulating because they feel fine. It's that, partly as we age, partly post kids, there are some changes there. Like, do we know what's kind of setting us up for being more sensitive?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of factors there, and that's the like empowering part of it, right? Where in terms of kind of like diagnosing PMS, that's where, we are doing that with like cycle tracking and really symptom tracking over, at least kind of like 2 to 3 cycles prospectively, meaning we're not like looking back and kind of assessing like, when was I feeling irritable or like, when was I feeling fatigued or, we're really bad at kind of remembering what was happening in the past. But by tracking our symptoms going forward, that is in one hand, like a diagnostic tool, but in the other, like that actually really helps our symptomology. So that can actually by tracking cycles and tracking symptoms. And we see this in like the menopause literature as well, that by kind of seeing when it's happening and understanding that it is in certain like hormonal phases, it kind of gives us a sense of like kind of agency over our health and kind of understanding like why we're feeling certain ways, and maybe setting up different habits and like lifestyle factors that can really support feeling like better and having lower kind of like PMS symptoms in that phase. So I think that's really, and I think like as practitioners for us, like now that the advent of like cycle tracking apps makes it amazing, right? Because I very rarely do I have a patient who comes into my office that has like no idea when symptoms are happening, because a lot of people are tracking symptoms now. So that's usually I'm just encouraging them to track more symptoms. So not just the period, but also like when they're feeling, some of the mood changes or kind of other physical symptoms. So kind of having that awareness can really help, and kind of understanding the hormone cycle can help. But also, like stress and managing like perceived levels of stress is a huge factor there as well. I think breaking down like that conversation is helpful too, because I think that stress is also kind of like a nebulous kind of conversation. I don't know what my stress levels are, and stress is everywhere. And really assessing, okay, but what are my like perceived levels of stress? How do I feel like I can kind of cope and like manage the stressors that are coming up? Do I feel like I have tools to do that? And we do see in the research that when we have higher levels of perceived stress one month, that can like increase PMS scores the next month. So really kind of creating and cultivating like a toolkit to manage stress too can be really helpful. Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that we can do, right, to kind of help with that, like those PMS symptoms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find that's interesting. There's a couple things in there that I want to kind of dive in on, but I do love the tracking. And I think too, that also helps people, I think women want to feel like their follicular self all the time. Right.
Right.
And they like love that performance piece, right? Whether it's at work or whether it's in the gym or whether it's like, you feel more fun, you feel more going.
Yeah.
And we don't often appreciate the other side, although I think there's maybe a conversation to be had about that. But when women don't track their symptoms or they don't feel connected to the differences between those halves of the month, I think we try and white knuckle our way through that second half, right? And it's like, well, I should be able to do this. I shouldn't feel so sensitive, right? I shouldn't be this tired. But when we track it over time, it actually like acknowledges those symptoms in a bit of a different way. So maybe we still shouldn't be as tired as we are, but at least you can see the like pattern of it instead of this like the fight against it.
Yeah. And I have that conversation a lot because I think it's important to remember that like as menstruators, like our hormones are in different levels, like through the month. So it's not realistic for us to think that we should feel the exact same, right? Like every day of the month, every week to week. And I think it's about, like I always kind of say, we want to get to a place where we're kind of, by tracking, we can be like in tune with some of those like hormone fluctuations. And then, so maybe in those few days before your period, you kind of notice, okay, I'm just like feeling a bit more sensitive. Maybe I'm like, it's a good time to just be in tune with some things in my life that maybe I need to rearrange or have some tough conversations with people. Cause it's just, I always kind of say it's a bit like your like bullshit meter has come up like in that week, right? Where you're just kind of like, okay, maybe there's some things that I want to change going forward. But at the same time, it shouldn't feel like we are like a completely different person that week, right? Or like we're just struggling to cope. So I think, and of course, there's things that we can do so you don't feel that way. But I think we still want to remember that there is like an ebb and a flow there, and maybe we don't like it, but that is part of it all, is kind of accepting those like ebbs and flows through the month, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And it's funny because I think there is like this hard conversation there around like what is appropriate,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say like giving in, right, to the way you feel versus what would we maybe consider treatable or pathological that we need to do something about. And I've, thinking back to like conversations I've had with patients where they'll be so frustrated about their fatigue. And I'm like, well, what is, and they're like, yeah, like there's this one night a month that I have to go to bed at like 8:15.
Yeah.
So like just go to bed at 8:15. Like, I don't know what we're so worried about, right? That there's like this one night that you're not going to like empty the lunch containers and, your laundry away. But when your kids go to bed, you're just going to also go to bed. Like, is that something we should be treating, or should we be like, giving in to some of those symptoms when I'm not sure that anyone's, going to get fired from their job if they go to bed one night a month at 8:15. I don't know. Like, what do you think? I think that's a tough conversation, actually.
I completely agree. And I feel like we have these kinds of clinical conversations a lot where it's just like, is this something that we should be treating? Or is this kind of something that we need to like accept, or like you kind of say, give in? And I think there is that I kind of look at it with that assessment of, okay, how is this like impacting my quality of life? Right? Like in the sense of, with the mood swings or irritability. Like, is this really impacting my like relationships in this like week before my period, right? Like, am I showing up not how I want to be with my family, my kids, or at work, or am I like really struggling to, like perform in some of these areas? And not that that bar has to be like so high, but there is kind of that place where it's like, how is this really impacting my quality of life and my ability to show up? And then there's also like, okay, so let's, like we said, get some of these other kind of factors in place where we're making sure that we're really taking care of our stress levels, we're getting enough sleep, we're exercising, we're kind of doing some of these things, and then see, okay, how do we feel now? Like once we've kind of gotten some of these like lifestyle factors and like supportive like practices in place.
And what does the research say about those things? Like what are most impactful? Like if someone's struggling, and they've acknowledged that their PMS is there, like what are the pillars of that kind of prevention plan, do you think?
Yeah. So when we're talking about like lifestyle factors, I mean, we kind of already touched on the like cycle tracking piece of it. I mean, exercise, no question, is really helpful. We've like looked at systematic reviews of like aerobic exercise. So anything from swimming, running, walking, like moderate intensity, a couple of times a week. And that really seems to improve like PMS scores, both physical and emotional. And then there was like systematic reviews where we look at, like Pilates or resistance training and kind of lump all these together. I feel like when it comes to PMS and supporting your mood in this way, like it doesn't really matter what we're doing. Like, let's just move and let's just like get the exercise in, right? Whether it's just that, that like kind of 150 minutes a week, like we can, again, it's something else that can be really complicated online. Like what's like the perfect workout or what's like the best thing for hormone in like each phase of the cycle and that kind of stuff. But really, like, let's just move if this is like your health goal. So exercise is a huge piece of it. And then I think something else that really interested me in the research too is around this idea of like emotional kind of regulation and a lot of different kind of functional coping practices that we can kind of support like patients and like women with who are kind of really struggling with their mood through the month. And how, even to just like back up a bit, we've kind of seen in the literature that there is this link between childhood trauma and PMS scores. And we think this could be mediated by difficulties with emotional regulation. So we've kind of seen this in some of the other like PMS and PMDD research where women with PMS really can struggle with regulating their emotions in the week before the period. So there's lots of things that can be done from kind of building that kind of toolkit, right? From engaging more traditionally with like a CBT therapist, but also even like mindfulness meditation, like progressive muscle relaxation is really interesting. So these different kind of tools that help us regulate our emotional responses can be really helpful to kind of reduce, and not just the emotional symptoms of PMS, but also the physical ones too, which is what I find so fascinating about it, which a lot of these treatment approaches kind of address both things, which I just find really fascinating.
Yeah, like if we treat that emotional regulation, that your physical body actually responds less to the discomfort or the bloating or the breast tenderness. It is so fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And what about what do you suggest people do in the moment? I have this conversation often with patients when they feel like they're in those, in the bad days, right? Because so many of the things we want people to do for their PMS are preventative, right? Or we're progressively working towards something, but we may not see change for months, right? And I think that's why you can get like disconnected from it. I've often told my patients, and I think I've even told myself this, I'm like, follicular phase me needs to write luteal phase me a letter, and vice versa, right? Like, and what would you say to yourself in those other like sides of the month? And quite often when we're in like the depths of it, you're like, you can't even think, right? Like I would say like, this is not a time for 5-year planning. But then when you're out of it, you always think kind of like, like that, maybe I need to do something about that. Like, I feel so much better now than I did last week. But the opposite is also true, right? Like when you're in the depths of maybe some despair with mood, you're like, oh my God, I need to do something about this. Like, this is not livable. And then a week later, you're fine. And you're like, who was that? Right. Like, that's not, I guess I moved through it. It's not a big deal. So we can like easily minimize our own experience, like every 2 weeks, depending on like which phase of the cycle, you're in. I always think we need to like write the other version of ourselves a letter about how important it is that we work on our PMS.
It's so interesting because it comes to that idea that when we are in those emotions, they often feel very permanent, right? Like when you're in that like luteal phase, that week before your period, if you're struggling with like irritability or feeling down, it's like, this is how it is. Why is it always like this? Like, I'm never going to get out of this. And vice versa. Like when, like you were saying, when you're in that follicular phase and you're feeling good, you almost like forget about that other side of the coin and kind of how you feel before your period. And I think, I think, yes, that's why we have to kind of have those like preventative kind of strategies in place. I mean, some of those things still work in the moment. Like when you're feeling that, that's kind of where that emotional like regulation kind of work comes from. Because the idea, like how we kind of like define what emotional regulation is, it's the ability to like recognize your emotion, have a bit of clarity in that emotional response, accept the emotional response, which is often the hardest part of it. And then kind of, you feel like you have a way to process the emotion and then how you're reacting from that place. So that's that pause that comes with some of that like mindfulness training and things like that. So I think, even like going for a walk outside, right? Like if you really feel like that emotional energy is really coming up, going for a walk outside, moving your body a little bit. Maybe it is about having some type of like journaling practice, kind of journaling the emotions and like what you're feeling. I do find the progressive muscle relaxation very interesting for like in the moment feeling. Like when you're feeling really tense, the practice is that you're kind of like tensing up all your muscles and then releasing them. And I find that can be really helpful. It's kind of that like stopgap in terms of bringing some like awareness to the emotional experience that you're having, and then kind of processing it and then making a decision about what you're doing next. And it comes back to the tracking too, because then you kind of like when you're in touch with where you're at in your cycle, you're a bit more like, okay, this is what's happening. I need to set up some things today. Like maybe I make sure that I exercise today. I make sure I take breaks in my day if it allows it. I get to sleep on time tonight. So you're kind of setting yourself up for success too.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, and I would love for there to be some studies on this around how women can support each other during these times of their cycle by like naming it and addressing it. And I do think like, and sometimes when I'm describing it to patients, I'm like, the goal is to be able to like almost hold the experience out in front of you and name it, right? Again, rather than it being like a part of us, right? And feeling like you said, like, this is permanent. This is this is how it is for me. Like being able to be like, wait a minute, right? And like hold it out and like at arm's length and be like, there's my PMS, right? There it is. Where did it come from? What was the trigger? Like, can I name it? Can I like see it for what it is? Can I recognize that maybe it's not going to last forever? But what I want to see is what happens when we involve other people as part of that, that recognition, because we know that if we train partners to understand PMS, that PMS gets better, right? Even if we just like make them watch a video about it. But I will say, like working in an environment full of women, when people's like, where it's it's normalized that we're like, I have PMS, I can't do that task, or I'm like super luteal today, so don't ask me anything hard. Or if we burst into tears, that it's like, it's just fine. And I don't know if that's happening in every workplace. I've never had another workplace.
It's been many years since I was in the corporate workspace when it was not happening back then. It's fascinating because we know the impact of community on our like mental health and how beneficial that is. And I think it speaks to exactly what you said, where, they even have those apps now, those menstrual cycle apps where you like put your partner's contact in and then they get an email being like, watch out, Keara's luteal phase is coming up next week. But certainly it's so helpful to like engage in those like conversations, and maybe it helps to give us, exactly like you said, a bit of a bird's eye view when we can like communicate how we're feeling to somebody else, right? So whether that is, you just have like a confidant in the workplace that's like a good friend that you're able to have these conversations with. I mean, it would be amazing if they were just around the like board table. This was like a conversation about where everyone was at. But there is that sense of being able to like communicate how you're feeling, naming it, which kind of separates it a little bit. And then also just having that sense of like community, and like we're all kind of experiencing certain things together, and maybe kind of shifting the conversation away from just like, oh, my hormones are making me crazy or whatever, right? But it's more about, this is where I'm at, and just given like the stressors and the commitments and things that I have right now, I need some support coping with it all.
And I think it would be nice to move away from the idea that like, if your partner's asking you about your cycle, that they're seeing it in a negative way, right? Like, oh, you must be on your period. Or, I think maybe even that like idea of having your partner getting an alert about your cycle might feel uncomfortable, because we've often weaponized the cycle against women for how they're feeling emotionally, rather than using it as a point of supporting her. But if, the hopeful piece there is that your partner actually does want you to feel more well, right? And if they felt like they could be part of the solution, it's just that we need to include them. Sometimes I'll have that conversation with women around like, how does your partner short circuit your mood, your bad mood on any day, right? Like often that person that's closest to us knows what that thing is that's going to, always use that word, short circuit, right? That would like break you from that pattern of feeling, that you can't see your mood for what it is, and you can't bird's eye view it, and you can't get out of it yourself. If they know that, right? Like, or be able to say like, I'm having PMS, like if you're late from work, everybody's going to die, right? That actually might help the entire family come together and be more supportive, rather than, the like, well, what's wrong with you kind of experience. The boys in my house make a lot of sad sound effects, and it's really irritating. And they know that when I'm in a bad mood, that they turn it up like to a level, like it's the like, psh, psh, like it's the, and they've created a song about these side effects that they do. And it's like, if mom is in a bad mood, or if I'm being irritable, they like sing this song, and they invented this on their own because they knew it was just like going to get my goat, but it's become a thing, right? Where if I'm irritable, then the two of them are like, da-na-na, psh, psh, and they do. And immediately I'm like, you guys are driving me nuts. But it short circuits that mood.
Yeah.
Like, okay, they're acknowledging and recognizing that I was just like in a spiral on my own, and the punching side effects are literally what pull me out of it. But that didn't come overnight. That came from like years of conversation around what I needed in those moments. And I need to be reminded about how silly boys are, actually.
That is so hilarious and so funny, but it's so true, because it is that, I like that like short circuit term that you said, because it is kind of just that shift in like perspective, and you can kind of come outside of your what we're just talking about emotions a lot here, like that emotional response, because for me it's like that one day, all of a sudden I come to the kitchen in the morning, and the like dirty dishes are there, and the like compost hasn't been emptied, and all of a sudden I just am like, what? Like, how is this not happening? But I'm like, wait a second, like last week it could have been like this and I would have been annoyed, but like it wouldn't have really kind of like set me off so much. And I think that kind of engaging that, like opening up that conversation with those that are like in your household with you, your family, partners, it can be very like supportive, and also in a way to help, like you said, just kind of bring you outside of yourself. And then you're like, oh yes, this is why I'm feeling this way. Bring some laughter to it, right? Like some humor, self-compassion, right? Like that's huge. So it just kind of helps. Those are all tools to really help you, kind of emotionally like regulate and know what you need to be supported. And it's a journey, like you said, like it's not something you figured out the first like year or two with your partner, right? Like it's been like over time and understanding yourself and your needs. And, as we said, like PMS does kind of change over time too. Like there's other factors that influence it, whether that is kind of like our perceived stress levels, after having kids, like things like that. Like there's just things that can kind of like change over time.
I think too, like even your friends, right? I think of that like a good example of, if you're going to cancel during that week of your period on your friends, you need to tell them that, like, just honestly, like, and it's like, that's not actually the right thing for me to be at home alone, sitting on my couch in my jammies. I need you to help me keep our plans, right? Or I need you to help me. I'm going to try and cancel and I need you to say no.
Yeah. Yeah. Like if that's what you need, if you're like, I know that I want that, like, connection, with my girlfriends, but it just feels too hard right now to get off the couch.
Yeah.
Then yes, help support me in making that decision to know that afterwards I'll feel a lot better.
That's right. And maybe that's not the right thing to do sometimes or for some people, but I always like to think about that like short circuit list. Like, what are the things that would make you forget you had PMS, right? And like historically, if you think back to another month where you were having a tough time and somehow you got out of it, what was it? Was it a walk? Was it just going to bed, right? Putting yourself to bed? Is it your partner? Is it your friends? Is it a phone call? And then building the support network so that the people around you help you execute that, even though, right? I think I've said to my trainer before, like, I feel horrific and I have super PMS. And then he's like, I'll see you at 5.
Yeah. And you're going to feel better after. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of like how I think about building that like stress toolkit to help kind of build that like perceived stress, that resiliency and stuff like that. But it's like your PMS toolkit, like, the things that are going to help you to feel better, whether that's a walk outside, connection, reading a book, those kinds of things. But you have those, and those are real-time tools that you can then rely on when you feel so in it, but you're like, wait a minute, I know that there's something that I can do to shift this around a bit.
And where do you think, Keara, my last kind of question for you is like, where do you feel like the research is going to go on this in the next like 5-10 years? And maybe where do you think it's going to go versus where would you like it to go? I don't know if those are two different answers, but like as our understanding of stress and the body and the nervous system and resiliency and stress and trauma and all of those things start to evolve, like what do you imagine happening in the way that we look at PMS?
Yeah, I have a whole hopeful list of places that I want the research to go. I'm very interested too in this because we see these ties with PMS and this like emotional this like sensitivity to hormone fluctuation and how that kind of then impacts other big times of life. So like postpartum, perimenopause, when hormones are shifting a lot. So kind of seeing more like long-term data in terms of how we're really like supporting this likely subset of women that are very sensitive to these like hormone fluctuations. And as we know, like many studies aren't that long-term. So just really understanding like that kind of long-term like trajectory and how we can like support women kind of like through the life cycle and all those big hormone dips. And then there's this other whole area too that we didn't really touch on, but just this idea of how PMS can also be like an exacerbation of like other, anxiety or depression and other kind of mental health struggles that women have and how to actually like support women through that. So yeah, like big hopes and dreams in terms of how we can really just support these women like through the whole life cycle.
Yeah, I would agree with all of those. I think it's fascinating that the women that struggle the most with PMS are the ones that also struggle the most with their mood during perimenopause and menopause. And so I have this hope that people that are in their 30s and 40s right now have the best mental health support in their perimenopause journey of any generation of women that have come before them, because we know, right, to screen for those pieces when we're looking at like the benefits and risks of using HRT. I'm really curious about that. Yeah, I agree. I love that, like, stress, resiliency, like, and then how your hormones make your brain feel sick when that combination is happening and in the same patient. And I hope that we spend more time on that so that it feels like we understand that the physiology of it, because I think sometimes when I'm describing it to patients right now, it can feel very like theoretical, even though we're so sure about what's happening. I would love for that to just be common knowledge, actually. Maybe that's what I mean.
Yeah. And it feels hard. I mean, we know that so many things in the research, though, is a bit like, well, we know this part of it. We're just not sure about this part of it, right? Like, it's hard to be so like certain of things. So I agree, like kind of drilling down more into the actual kind of cause and exactly what's happening, even though we have an idea of kind of the reasoning for it. But just supporting women, because it absolutely is like not just in your head, right? Like, it is a physiological process that's happening, but having more like clarity around that.
Yeah, I love that. How can our listeners find you, Keara? And to dovetail that, like, what do you think people should be looking for in a practitioner that's working on PMS? But I'd love for you to share how our listeners can get to know you more and what you do with your patients.
Yes. So you can find me on Instagram is probably the easiest place at drkearataylor.nd. I practice in Toronto, and then I see patients virtually all across Ontario. And I think it's just important to always find a practitioner that you kind of connect with, and that like you feel really understands you and listens to you, and you kind of understand their approach, and then also is kind of well versed in the research and kind of what's coming out about PMS, obviously, because things are kind of always coming up and changing. So yeah, that's where you can find me.
Amazing. And if you're a practitioner listening, Keara is going to be part of our women's health research update in the fall of 2023, looking at the newest literature on PMS and PMDD and how we support those patients. And so, we're really excited about your contributions to this area of our work, Keara. So thanks so much for being here with me today.
Oh, my pleasure. It was so fun. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. We're changing things in women's health. One episode, one topic, one conversation at a time. I want you to feel confident in your health. Please remember that the podcast does not constitute a medical relationship or medical advice. Please talk to your family doctor, your practitioner, your specialist, or anyone on your health team if you think some of the topics we discussed in today's episode apply to you. Take care of yourself. Until next time.